delay. We've been having some technical issues getting, but I think that's all sorted out. And also, I know there were problems with the red line today. Difficulty getting this. But welcome to meeting of the Washington Network for Children and Armed Conflict. We've been meeting since 2004. And Washington Network is a partnership between Search for Common Ground, which is where we are at the moment, and the Displaced Children and Orphans Fund of USAID. And the Washington Network was initiated as a forum where people from various communities in Washington could come together and share information on issues related to children and armed conflict. There are people from government, people from the NGO world, people from the university world, consultants, others that come together here at Washington Network. So I want to welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. Sorry for the delay, so we probably will run a bit beyond noon to give enough time for our speakers and for discussion today. But let's just go around and quickly say who we are and who we're with, if you're with anybody. So, would you like to?
Sure. I'm Janella Nelson. I'm the Education Advisor for Childhood International.
Mira, I'm an intern with Search.
Christoph Colligan, I'm also an intern with Search.
Hi, I'm Judith Lay. I'm with the Children's Rights Program at Wellspring Advisors.
Laura Berry, an intern at Search.
I'm Sandrine Boko. I'm also an intern at Search.
David Knackoff, I'm an interested individual.
I'm Jan Kublatz. I usually work as a consultant.
I'm Lisa Jacobson. I'm also an intern with Search.
I'm Jessica Broom, and I'm also an intern.
I'm Quincy White. I'm also an intern at Search.
My name is Melcy, and I'm with Communications at Search.
And I'm Jessica Murray with Communications at Search.
I'm Christopher Bonet, and I'm an intern at Search.
Okay.
I'm Donna Francesco, head of HR here at Search.
I'm Kim Hart. I work in our Global Affairs and Partnerships team.
I'm Sandra Malone. I'm Vice President at Search, and we certainly are en force here today. Welcome to everybody. Thank you.
I'm Constance Rodriguez, a grad student at GW.
I'm Marcus Laws. I'm at the SIT Graduate Institute.
Well, welcome to everyone, and welcome to those who may have joined us online as well. So, at this point, oh, and I should have introduced myself. I'm John Williamson. I am Senior Technical Advisor with USAID's Displaced Children and Orphans Fund.
And your lovely neighbor to the left
is Kelly, who will take things from here.
Sure. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. I hope no one had too much trouble with the red line. So my name is Caitlin Kelly. I'm the Program Associate for the Children and Youth Division at Search. And for those of you who know Saji, he is very sorry he couldn't be here. He's in the Congo right now supporting one of our youth events. But we're really excited to have this event today and to have two really wonderful speakers. Our topic for today is protecting education from attack during armed conflict, which is, if you've been following the news in recent months, a very timely and relevant topic. And so without further ado, I'll just give a quick introduction for our two speakers. You should hopefully have gotten their bios with the invitation, but our first speaker is Brendan O'Malley, who's joining us wonderfully from London, I believe, on the computer here. So Brendan is a freelance journalist, author, photographer, and documentary maker. He has over 25 years of experience writing about education, development, international politics, with a very strong focus on education and protecting education. Wendy Wheaton over here, hi Wendy, is going to be our second speaker today. She is currently the Senior Associate for Education and Conflict with Creative Associates International, and she's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And she's got over 20 years experience working on education and conflict, including 15 years based overseas in a lot of different countries. So without further ado, we'll have Brendan start off with his presentation, and then we'll go over to Wendy after that.
Thank you. I know that your introduction is about 5 years out of date. So it's now 30 years rather than 25. But
30 years, wow.
It makes me younger. Sorry about that. So yeah, I thought I would just. So I prepared a presentation which I'll speak to you. Unfortunately, I don't have any visuals, so I hope you'll bear with me on that. I wasn't sure how it was going to work over the internet. So I'll begin. I've been asked to talk about trends in attacks on education, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the subject, but there are some stories about attacks on education that we are all familiar with. We could take the example of Malala Yousafzai, who was shot in October 2012, a target of the Pakistan Taliban. Her story is well known worldwide. She was 15 years old, had just got into the truck that served as a school bus, only a few hundred yards from her school in Kushal school in Mingara, West Pakistan, when a masked man stepped in front of the vehicle and an armed accomplice with a pistol climbed onto the tailgate at the rear. He leaned into the truck, asked which of the girls inside was Malala, and as the driver sensed that something was going wrong and accelerated, the gunman opened fire and shot Malala in the head. He also wounded a couple of her friends, and then he jumped off. Now, as we know, Malala didn't die, fortunately. She was rushed to hospital and eventually taken to England, where surgeons saved her. Since then, she has recovered remarkably and has become a global figurehead for campaigns against attacks on schools, as well as campaigns for girls' education. Another example, which you may have heard of, is the kidnapping of 270 schoolgirls in their school dormitory in Chibok in the northeast of Nigeria in July. I think it was in July this year. They were taken by members of the armed group Boko Haram, whose name means Western education is a sin. And some 57 of the girls have since escaped, but their captors are still holding 219 and are using them as a bargaining chip for the release of 30 of their own commanders who are currently held by the government. Now, this story first caught the attention of the world's media when Boko Haram leader Abu Bakr Shekau launched a video message in which he admitted abducting the girls and said he was holding them as slaves and threatened to sell them on the market. Now, perhaps the most famous attack on education of all is actually the school massacre in Beslin, which occurred 10 years ago this month in the Caucasus, when a group of armed militants took over school number 1 in Beslin, North Ossetia, in the Russian Federation, and held 777 children and more than 300 parents and staff hostage at gunpoint. And the siege lasted a few days and ended in explosions and a firefight, during which 334 of the hostages were killed. And it was the subject of extensive media reporting as it happened. Now, there are several similarities between all three incidents. The first is that in each case the victims were deliberately targeted, and this is the case in what we mean by attacks on education around the world. We're not talking about collateral damage or accidental killing of people in war. And secondly, the perpetrators were all armed men, apparently involved in an armed struggle of one sort or another. A third similarity is that, atypically, all three incidents were highly publicized worldwide, whereas many other attacks in the same countries or regions have only received a minor attention in the media. So, for instance, if we take the example of the Pakistan example, the truth is that we only get glimpses of the true numbers of incidents in the international media. And in many cases within conflict countries, reports of incidents are only mostly found as a small mention within reports on conflict in general. So they just get a sentence or two. So we take the Pakistan example. We know that Malala was personally targeted, most likely because despite being only 15 years old, she had been speaking out publicly on girls' education for 4 years by the time she was shot. In fact, I would recommend you read her book. Very interesting, the extent to which her and her father were campaigning on education for girls before that incident. But incidents like shootings of individuals are atypical in Pakistan. So while at least 30 children were killed in attacks on schools and school transport in her country in 2009 to 2012, more than 800, possibly more than 900 schools were attacked in the same period. Mostly they were bombed at night when they were empty, so they were deliberately avoiding hitting civilians. Similarly, in Nigeria, the case of the kidnapped girls has rightly earned massive attention in the international media, not least because of the scale and the fact that the case is ongoing, with most of the girls still missing. But there have been many other, often brutal incidents in Nigeria over the past few years. And just to give you an example, sorry, I'm in trouble with my technology here. In February this year, militants approached a school in northern Nigeria, sent all the girls home, and then they set fire to the they locked the doors and set fire to the boys' dormitory, and shot and slit the throats of any of those who tried to escape. At least 58 students were killed. Even in the Caucasus, although there's not been a repeat of the type of incident we had at Beslin, there have been repeated killings of individual teachers, reportedly by Islamist extremists, but certainly by militants, and several attacks on schools. So how do we get a true picture of the scale and nature of attacks? The differences between the international reporting and the real picture are the reason why we need good monitoring and reporting of attacks on education, so that we can highlight the problem and encourage better responses. Without comprehensive information on the scale and nature and on the impact of attacks and on the reported motives, we can't understand the significance of what is taking place or begin to develop and implement the variety of responses that are needed. Globally, there have been two significant developments over the past 7 years on monitoring and reporting of attacks on education. One is the development of the UN-led monitoring and reporting mechanism on 6 grave violations against children in situations of armed conflicts. And one of those violations is attacks on schools and hospitals. I'm assuming you're all very familiar with this. Its reporting of, the MRM's reporting of attacks on schools was very patchy to begin with, missing large numbers of incidents in some countries. But then it became much more focused on this issue with the passing of UN Resolution 1998 in 2011, which made attacks on school a trigger violation for the MRM. This effectively meant that the MRM reporting could be triggered wherever a pattern of attacks on schools could be found, whereas previously they could only be reported in countries where the MRM had been triggered by a different violation, such as recruitment of child soldiers. Lots of cases of countries where there were large numbers of attacks were not being covered in the reports until quite recently. And it's still some are not covered by the reports. Since Resolution 1998 was passed, we have seen a steady increase in the breadth of reporting of attacks on schools in the Secretary General's, the UN Secretary General's reports on children in armed conflict. Now, these reports list the guilty armed forces and armed groups, with the potential consequence that they will face sanctions from the Security Council unless they agree an action plan to end the violations. Now, the definition of attacks on schools used by the MRM is usefully broad in meaning, so it doesn't just cover attacks on school buildings, it also covers attacks on students and teachers, and they do report the military use of buildings, and some elements of denial of access to education. So, for instance, they may report the lengths to which children are delayed by security checkpoints in occupied Palestinian territories, for instance. Now, the reports of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict are year by year improving their reporting of attacks on schools, and following another resolution, 2143 this year, they will also provide enhanced reporting of military use of schools, which is really quite important, as we will see. However, the Secretary General's reports do also have their limitations, and in that they only report on a hard core of countries. The latest report covers 15 countries. They do not always disaggregate the figures for hospitals from those of attacks on schools because they're lumped together in one violation, and sometimes that makes it impossible to work out how many schools have been attacked. And they do not cover higher education because that's not part of their remit. Now, the second important development in monitoring and reporting that I wanted to talk to you about is the series of education under attack studies. And here I have to declare an interest. These were the first global studies on the issue, and the first two, published in 2007 and 2010 by UNESCO, were commissioned by Mark Richmond, then a UNESCO director, and I was the researcher and sole author of both of them. And the third one, published this February, was published by the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And Mark Richmond was the project leader, and I was the lead researcher, and I was assisted by Jane Callister. And for the coalition, Zema Korsen-Neff and Dia Nijam led the review process, which was very important to it. Now, the main difference this time is that the research was much better resourced, and we were able to commission up to 16 other researchers and academics to contribute to the research in various ways, rather than just relying on me. The education under attack studies have gone into much more breadth and depth on attacks on schools than the Secretary-General's annual reports. And in addition, unlike the MRM, they are not restricted to looking at attacks in conflict countries, which is an important distinction. And they're not restricted to school education only, they also look at higher education. So the studies themselves have also grown in depth over the series. The first one was quite brief, it took 4 months to produce. The second one was much more detailed and took 7 months. And the third one was wider in scope and took the best part of 2 years, with a lot more personnel involved, and was reviewed by all the members of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And these included UNESCO, UNICEF, UNHCR, Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, Education Above All, and the Scholars at Risk Network. So quite a comprehensive system of review. The scope of the latest study was also significantly broader. It looked much more systematically at higher education attacks and at the military use of school and university buildings than previous ones, which means that the figures can't be compared directly, because you have to take that into account. Now, these studies and the Secretary-General's reports have been part of a concerted attempt to place attacks on education higher up the international agenda and to encourage the development of a range of responses. So today I'm going to tell you about the findings of the 2014 study and what it tells you about the current trends. First, let me explain how the data was gathered. It was gathered from a wide range of secondary sources, mostly, including United Nations monitoring and reporting, research by human rights groups and media reports, all of which have differing purposes and varying levels and methods of verification. And additional research was gathered by information requests sent to UN agencies and international and local NGOs, by phone interviews with in-country experts, and in some cases by in-country research by experienced human rights researchers and journalists. So the findings from the different sources were cross-checked against each other for reliability and accuracy, and the study was extensively reviewed by experts in human rights, international law, education in emergencies, and research methodology, and by the member organisations of the coalition. So, first of all, we have to understand what we mean by attacks on education. What definition did we use? In the 2014 study, we're focused on threats or deliberate use of force against students, teachers, academics, and any other education personnel, as well as attacks on educational buildings, resources, materials, and facilities, including transport. These attacks may be carried out for political, military, ideological, sectarian, ethnic, or religious reasons. The common thread is that these incidents involve the deliberate use of, or threat to use, force in ways that disrupt, harm, or deter the provision of education and enjoyment of the right to education. The study additionally reports on the use of schools for military and security operations by armed forces or police or other security forces, or by armed non-state groups, including rebel forces or any other armed military, ethnic, political, religious, or sectarian group. This is an issue of military use is an issue of concern because the use of education buildings and facilities can turn them into a target for attack and can displace students, teachers and academics and other education personnel, thereby denying students access to education. So the study also includes information on recruitment of children from schools or sexual violence by military groups and forces, but only where it takes place at schools or en route to schools. So this is a subset of the general problem of child recruitment and sexual violence by actors in conflict. So, for instance, Human Rights Watch has reported that the armed group Al-Shabaab has abducted or recruited thousands of children in Somalia, mostly from schools, to take military training, and they've gone into schools and lined up girls at gunpoint to select those they will force to marry their fighters. and girls have been shot for refusing to obey by trying to run away. In some cases, they've tried to climb out of the second story of the school to escape. The study does not count, as I said, general collateral damage as an attack, except regarding incidents in the vicinity of education buildings, and where the effect of intentional violence is to harm students or education personnel or facilities. So if a bomb is detected alongside a school with the intention of, it's placed alongside a school but the intention is to blow up a passing military patrol, and the school is damaged or students killed, that would still be counted, because it was an intentional act that, if carried out, was likely to have that effect. Moreover, the study, there's some things it doesn't include, which is quite important in the American context, which is it doesn't include one-off non-politically motivated violence by students or individual adults, such as the killing of 20 children and 6 staff at Sandy Hook Elementary School, the type of school shootings you see quite a lot of, or threats of them in the United States. And the reason for this is that although these attacks are devastating, they're not carried out by armed groups or armed forces or individuals associated with them, or ideological, political, military, religious or sectarian motives. So we just felt if we brought those in, it would be different attacks with a very different motive, and it would just muddy the waters, whereas all the other types of attacks fit together more closely. So when you're thinking about responses, that's important. So who are and what are the targets of attack? The victims include students, teachers, academics, all other education staff, including support staff and transport staff. So we're talking about janitors, bus drivers, building contractors. We also counted education officials who attacked, whether they were local or national, education trade unionists, who are particularly targeted in some countries, and education aid workers, so everybody who contributes to education. Anyone who's working to support education, paid or unpaid. Other targets include educational structures, so we're talking about buildings, or even temporary learning spaces, even if there isn't a building, as long as it's a recognised learning space. Education offices, education ministry offices, educational printers, warehouses or printing works, examination halls, those are sometimes targeted. These sorts of things. Educational vehicles used to transport teachers and students to school. We also included special educational events which may not take place in a school, like a graduation ceremony, or some kind of educational festival or educational conference, because these may have special symbolic importance as an attack on education and usually put high numbers at risk. So who is carrying out the attacks? Well, the types of perpetrator include armed forces, including international armed forces, police forces, intelligence services, paramilitaries, militias acting on behalf of the state, but also armed non-state groups, rebel forces, any other armed military, ethnic, political, religious or sectarian group. And sometimes they are violent mobs that are not organised as an armed group but are emanated by similar motives. We haven't generally included criminal attacks, but we did look at the phenomenon of attacks by armed organised criminal groups, including drug cartels, and the impact of related security operations in those situations where violence is widespread. So really there we're talking mainly about Mexico and Colombia. Now let me turn to the important thing, which is the study's findings, which is really what you want to hear about, the scale, what's going on. Researchers found that over the 4-year period, 2009 to 2012, thousands of targeted attacks on education have been reported across dozens of countries, spanning most regions of the world. The vast majority of those attacks involved the bombing, shelling or burning of schools or universities, or the killing, injury, kidnapping, abduction or arbitrary arrest of students, teachers and academics. In addition, education facilities were used as bases, barracks or detention centres by armed groups and armed forces. There was also significant evidence of children being recruited for use as combatants from schools, and only a few incidents reported of sexual violence by military forces and armed groups against students and teachers. But obviously there may be an issue there with those kinds of incidents ever being reported, so we don't know how accurate that is. Some of the figures indicating the scale of attacks surprised us because they were far higher than in the previous study, which may reflect the greater resources we were able to put into the research, and do not necessarily indicate an increase in the rate of attack. They do, however, indicate that the scale of the problem is far larger than previously reported. In total, attacks on education were reported in 70 countries during the reporting period, and there were 30 countries in which more than 5 attacks were reported. Now, there was a hardcore of 13 countries where far more significant numbers of attacks took place. So there were 8 countries with more than 500 documented attacks on schools, universities, staff and students, or more than 500 students, teachers or other personnel, but education personnel were attacked, or education buildings attacked, or used for military purposes. So these countries were Côte d'Ivoire, DRC, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, which is counted as one country, Libya, Mexico, and Yemen. We call that category heavily affected, but there was another category of very, very heavily affected countries. These were 5 countries that faced significantly higher numbers of attacks still. These are countries with more than 1,000 documented attacks on schools, universities, staff and students, or more than 1,000 students, teachers or other education personnel attacked, or education buildings attacked, or used for military purposes in the same reporting period. So they were Afghanistan, Colombia, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria. In 24 of the 30 countries with more than 5 attacks, armed non-state groups and armed forces used schools as bases or barracks, weapons caches, detention centres, and even torture chambers, entirely displacing students and teachers, or interrupting the learning process and putting those students and staff who remained in school at risk of attack by opposing forces. It's not uncommon for armed groups or armed forces to occupy a school while their classes are still ongoing in a school, believe it or not, and then they're subject to incoming fire. These occupations of schools sometimes lasted for weeks, sometimes for months, and in some cases for years. Some 1,923 incidents of military use of educational buildings were reported in 15 countries, across 15 countries. The country most affected by direct attacks on schools was Pakistan, where at least 838 schools, and possibly as many as 919 schools, were deliberately attacked, mostly blown up. The most dangerous country to be a teacher was Colombia, where 140 teachers were assassinated, and at least 1,038 teachers received death threats in the reporting period for 4 years, 2009 to 2012. And another source, a teacher union, FECODE, reported a far higher figure of 5,000 teachers receiving death threats in just 2 years, 2011 2012. I think we have no way of knowing which of the figures is the most accurate, so we've gone with the government ones. One of the places where children were most likely to be recruited from school as fighters was Somalia, where most of 948 children taken by armed groups in 2011 were abducted from school. And there were 79 incidents of children being recruited from schools in Somalia in 2011 to 12 by anti-government forces. Some individual incidents of attacks on education resulted in large numbers of casualties. So there was one in Somalia, for instance, in October 2011. An al-Shabaab suicide bomber exploded a truck filled with drums of fuel outside a compound in Mogadishu, housing the Education Ministry and other ministries, and killing 100 or more people, many of whom were students and parents. They come there for a meeting. In a pre-recorded message, the bomber reportedly said he was targeting the students who were due to gather at the Ministry of Education to obtain examination results needed for scholarships to go abroad. Now, the country with by far the most reported incidents of military use of schools is Syria, according to one report by the Syrian Human Rights Network, by mid-January 2013, the government forces had used approximately 1,000 schools as detention and torture centres, and used schools to house security and intelligence personnel, or used them as firing positions. So that's the scale. But it's not just the information about the nature of attacks that is important, or the scale. When thinking about what responses to make, we also need to know what are the short and long-term impacts and why these attacks are carried out. So I'm going to look at the impacts first. Where attacks on schools, students and teachers are persistent, or the use of force, real or threatened, blocks recovery from attacks, effects which impinge on student attainment and access to good quality education can include several things. They can include persistent demotivation and distraction of students, teachers and staff by fear or stress or trauma. They can include chronic disruption of attendance or permanent dropout of students, teachers and staff. They can include falling recruitment of staff, leading to further teacher shortages, declining enrolment of students, hindering national and global attempts to achieve education for all. All these effects have short, medium and long-term dimensions, but the longer attacks persist, or that violence blocks recovery, the deeper and more lasting the effects are likely to be. We should bear in mind that conflicts can go on for a long time, 12 years on average in poor countries. And attacks on education can be very persistent in some places throughout the conflict. So the cumulative impact on education needs to be addressed. Hundreds of thousands of children may be denied access to education, either for months and in some cases for years. For instance, in Yemen, 54 schools were closed for up to 2 months after 143 attacks on education in 2011, affecting 182,000 students. In Afghanistan, the number of schools reported closed due to security threats ranged from 600 in 2009 to 800 in 2012. And that impact is extended if the education authorities take years to rebuild or repair schools, or if schools face continuing attack because the government takes no measures to address the education grievances that fuel the attacks, or provide security. So, in addition, military use can put schools out of action for years at a time. In India's Naxalite conflict, police occupied some schools for 3 years. In South Sudan, armed forces occupied some schools for up to 5 years. And then we come to the motives. Why do these attacks take place? As well as knowing about the impact, this is important because obviously it will shape how we respond to them. The truth is that in most cases there's no definitive evidence of the actual motive behind an attack because the perpetrator has not been arrested, charged or investigated. Instead, we rely on the reported motives. Sometimes this is information gleaned from official orders issued by an armed group or threats. In many cases, it is the presumed motive reported in the local media or by NGOs with a local presence. The motives can vary, and there can be a number of different motives at play for any one attack. So some Taliban groups, for instance, may attack schools to prevent girls' education taking place. Others might attack schools to show who is in control of the area, because the school is a symbol of government. Some armed groups attack schools because they are perceived to be vehicles of forced assimilation. For instance, in southern Thailand, historically, schools were used to impose the Thai language and versions of Thai history and Buddhism onto local Malay Muslims, whose own language and customs of dress were forbidden. Elsewhere, academics have been killed, tortured or jailed for belonging to the wrong side in a sectarian conflict, for instance in Iraq, or for providing an alternative point of view on policies in countries where the government will not tolerate plurality. So teacher and student trade unionists have been imprisoned for challenging education policy. And in many cases, attacks are not targeting the concept or even the type of education. Quite differently, other attacks are about gathering resources for the war effort. So this particularly applies to the recruitment of children. In the past, in DRC, armed groups have turned up at schools with trucks to take students away to help fight their battles, or sometimes even to use them as sex slaves. Many schools, of course, have been seized for use as barrack spaces or firing positions. So now we come to the crux of what we can do. What can be done about attacks? Are they just an unavoidable part of wars or political tension, or are there measures that can actually be taken? Now, Wendy, with whom I worked on the Global Education Cluster's Protecting Education in Conflict-Affected Countries project a couple of years ago, is going to talk to you about civil society responses. So I thought it would just be helpful to put those in the context of the full breadth of responses before she begins. A wide range of responses to attacks have been attempted. These fall into several categories: measures to prevent or deter attacks, measures to reduce their impact, and measures to improve recovery from them. They cover activities such as physical protection, monitoring and reporting, accountability, and negotiations with armed forces and armed groups to try to reach agreement not to attack or not to use schools militarily. I just lost my place, so bear with me a second. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the work of the MRM and the Security Council and the role of monitoring and reporting in providing a degree of accountability and informing responses. The fundamental need in accountability is for national governments and the International Criminal Court to ensure that perpetrators are investigated, charged and punished appropriately to deter other attacks. Currently, unfortunately, very few prosecutions of perpetrators of attacks on education have been documented. In terms of addressing the military use, the draft Lusong guidelines on military use of school, which have been encouraged and drawn up in collaboration with experts from the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, could be an important step in trying to persuade armed forces and groups to change their behaviour during military operations and end use of schools. Another very important area of response which might get overlooked is education policy and planning. This is important particularly for addressing the problem in some situations where grievances over education have become one of the main drivers of conflict, or just one of the drivers of conflict, and they must be addressed. These grievances must be addressed to build peace or prevent attacks in the first place. In some places, this might be because, for instance, that access policies are discriminatory. Some groups are not, schools are not being built in areas where certain ethnic groups are based. In others, it might be because the curriculum prevents students learning in their own language, or is designed to stamp out their culture. So a useful example is to look at is to go back to Thailand, which I mentioned before, where there is clear evidence of education policies being a factor in the conflict. And at the same time, the government has gone to unusual lengths to address these grievances, which is very interesting, in an effort to reduce attacks on schools. So in the far south, Malay Muslims are fighting for autonomy from Buddhist Thailand. As mentioned earlier, government schools there have been in the past used as vehicles of assimilation. So they've imposed Thai as a language of instruction, Buddhism as a religion, and Thai versions of history. And many of the teachers have been Thai Buddhists too. Since an armed insurrection by disparate groups began in 2004, militants have assassinated around 170 teachers and burned down hundreds of schools. The government responded in the first instance by increasing the troop presence, providing armed protection for schools in the form of troop patrols of the approach roads, guard posts, troop escorts for teachers, and in response to teacher demands, they even permitted teachers to carry arms. That in itself is quite is a very sensitive move, as I found out when I went down to the area, because the teacher body is made up of Buddhist Thai teachers and Malay Muslim teachers. So the Malay Muslim teachers clearly felt threatened by the issuing of arms to teachers in schools, from the ones I talked to. Now, the government has had more success with halting attacks on schools than halting assassination of teachers. It's been helped by the fact that they have rebuilt damaged schools with concrete instead of inflammable wood. So there's a practical way that they've reduced the likelihood of damage. Although there have been some notable dips in the numbers of teachers killed in recent years and the number of soldiers killed protecting education, there's still a large number being killed, and compared to most countries, and even more soldiers have been killed protecting teachers than actual teachers have been killed. So, in a sense, they pay a very high price for providing that protection. Now, the Southern authorities, what's interesting for you, I think, is that for the Southern authorities have in recent years added another important strategy of trying to build relations between the schools and the local Malay community. So instead of relying on hard protection, they're beginning to address perhaps the grievances. They did this by hiring local Malay Muslim teachers en masse, by changing the curriculum. So they brought in teaching of the local language. They extended the school week by a day to 6 days a week to incorporate 6 hours of extra teaching of Islamic studies. And they invested in community projects such as vegetable gardens for the school. They also send teachers to children's homes when it's too dangerous for them to go to school. So that's quite a change of approach, rather than thinking that only protection, hard protection matters. There's no research yet into how well these measures are being implemented or what effects they've had, but it's an interesting example that shows a wide range of responses that can be made beyond accountability, beyond security measures. And in many countries, experts believe that a key component of protecting schools from attack is finding ways to increase a sense of community ownership of schools and community ownership of development, and that a sense that the schools are theirs, something to which they feel their children belong, and something which is worth protecting, rather than something imposed from the outside. And that's an important reason why civil society responses are needed. So I think this is a good point to stop. I hope I haven't sound like I'm droning on for so long, but I think there's a good point to hand over to Wendy.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks so much. So I tend to stand up, but I think I'm going to stay seated for the.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Brendan. I mean, I think we have a sense of the scale, some of the types of attacks, some of the issues, some of the impacts. I mean, there's probably a lot more to read with regards to these studies, but I'm really happy to start with that, because now what I'm going to talk a little bit about is civil society, but also programmatic responses in situations of conflict, whereby children and youth are caught up in the conflict, and education programming makes an effort to not necessarily resolve, but at least assist and help children to continue to learn. I'm going to keep my presentation relatively short. I cut out a few things just so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Oh, good. Nice. Now, how does this work? Let's see.
Down here on the bottom. The next one. No, the far next one. There you go.
Slideshow, education in conflict, search for common ground. Here we go. And then I guess I just click it. So, brief history, going straight into how education protects. In what way? Then talking a little bit about the two faces of education. I want us to be clear that education is not always a positive influence. There are things that are dangerous about it and important to understand. And then because of that complexity, what do we do with that? We need a conflict-sensitive analysis within the education sector to get a good idea of what a program should really look like. What should those elements be? Then what I'm going to do is talk about program design, and I'm going to scratch the research stuff for the moment. That'll be the next meeting that we have, or one in the future. But I just want to get into the program design and give you a sense of what are the choices being made by programs because of conflict. What are some of the things that over the last 20 years people have considered good practice? There are some small research projects that have pointed to making these decisions for what elements to include in education programs in situations of conflict. And so I want to just go over the basics. You know, what are some of these choices that are made for programs? Okay. Quickly on the history, back in 2000, a group of people, Education for All. What does that mean, Education for All? Who can tell me? All girls, all vulnerable. all those that might have been associated with armed conflict, all those disabled, all, really all. A group of people said, well, wait a minute, what about all these raging conflicts that are going on in the world today? And so a subgroup got together and developed what's called the Deter Framework for Action and said, well, these are some of the things we can do to overcome these situations of conflict. And really this was, you know, an impetus to start a lot of discussion around what to do for children and youth living in situations of conflict. How can they learn? How can they access education? And from those discussions came the the Interagency Network on Education in Emergencies. Also, what came from that are minimum standards. How could a government, maybe an academic or a practitioner, think about what is the minimum requirement for education? These are kind of notes. And then researchers started to think, well, let's look academically at how really conflict is affecting education. After the beginnings of 2000, there was kind of mid-2006, there was a key publication that said, well, it's not only that conflict stops education from happening, but actually education may be exacerbating conflict, and how. So this discussion about these two cases, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. After this kind of mid-2000 set of discussions, many of these lessons about and looking at, well, yeah, education can have an effect on conflict in a negative way and in a positive way. It's not all positive. And so later, in the late 2000s, 2011, 10, 12, there's a bunch of initiatives, advocacy groups, better research, Brendan's work on education under attack, the Global Education Cluster. There's a coalition that's been established to look at education and protecting it from attack, the MRM, et cetera, et cetera. And now what we have is a lot of information that we're trying to work with in order to design better programs. And that's what we'll get into now. First, the positive. Education does protect in physical ways, in emotional ways, and also in cognitive ways. Physically, it's a space. It's a protected set of maybe walls, maybe a community center, maybe a tent, maybe in a home, maybe in a church. But it's a space that's structured for children to learn and play. This is a physical protection. It also offers protection from recruitment. Sometimes it can be a target of recruitment, but it does offer some protection to give alternative options to joining gangs, to going into the armies, to getting involved in drugs, etc. So it also offers survival messages. What do we do in the case of Ebola? There's a place in a school with a captive young person and set of children and youth that can actually gain a great deal of information physically, what to do, what they should do, and they bring that back to their families and they tell them, this is a protection. Emotional protection. A student can say they're a student, they have a new identity. Amidst conflict, identities get lost. Maybe they're displaced from their families. They lose part of their identity. This gives them a student identity. This is an emotional protection. In addition, sports, music, drama, things that link back to their traditional practices. This is an emotional protection in that the children are able to express themselves as they did in the past, and this gives them some assistance toward recovery. For those that are particularly vulnerable, this allows them to socialize with other children. Again, an emotional protection. Then we have the cognitive. Literacy, numeracy, they're learning basic skills, academic skills. Knowledge of citizenship, human rights. They're starting to think about what actions they can take as students, as children. And then there's these critical skills to analyze things and make choices and act upon things. These are cognitive protections. So education has all three of these. Now about these two faces, is this new to anyone? Has anyone not heard of these two faces? Raise your hand if you have not heard of these two faces. Okay. So the idea is basic. Education, its content can promote peace, inclusiveness, and stability through the availability of education. It's there. You can learn. You have hope. You're starting to think about the future. On the other hand, if that education system and that content is designed in a way that builds upon previous inequities in the society, you're in fact doing some harm because you're exacerbating those inequities. You're deepening those divisions and cleavages within society. So this is where today we're really thinking hard about what program design looks like and what should be included in programs so as to promote the peaceful uses of education and avoid increasing inequities or divisions within a society. On that, there are really 6 questions. There's 6 there. There are really 6 questions, and I try to simplify these. But there's a what's called a starting point, conflict-sensitive analysis. So together with civil society actors, practitioners, donors, those doing programming, we just have to ask a few things before getting started. What are the conflict drivers? I just came back from northern Nigeria. There's clearly, within the conflict, one element that speaks to differences in investment in the education sector that look quite different in the South as compared with the North. Is this a driver of conflict? Just asking these questions. Thinking about whether the program would make this situation worse or would make this situation better. And thinking that through as a group. Now, are there things that are necessary to add to education, given that, say, an entire, maybe 50% of the population had been associated with the fighting forces? And you start an education program, you might want to add some additional psychosocial support to that educational content, given that 50% of those learners had been associated with fighting forces. You're integrating them into the education program, but you may want to add something specific that speaks to the context and might help them integrate. Are we thinking carefully about who is there? And Brendan talked about this a lot. Who's the learner? Who's included, who's excluded? Who's the teacher? Who is in the community? And are we being equitable about the access? Are we ensuring that those who may not have been able to learn before are now able to? Are we making sure that we're making good decisions about this? Are we making sure there's some female teachers that might be a role model to then attract and some of the girl students maybe more easily, put parents at ease in terms of safety issues, etc., etc. And then are there policy openings? Sometimes conflict, given that there is positive and negative aspects, at times it's an opening to make change. And an opening to build back better, to rethink some of the policies and advocate for better policy for education. Finally, we can't forget that there are people around us working, and this is something that as practitioners, as agencies, as donors, you know, from the humanitarian world, from the development world, we tend to forget that we're working alongside other groups, including civil society. And that we have to think of this as a collective, coordinating our efforts so that we have synergistic impact as opposed to competitive gap-making impacts when we're doing work in conflict settings. So these are just 6 questions. So what do we have to think about before we get started on? And this isn't a one-off thinking. This should reoccur throughout the project life. But it's something for educators that has now been emboldened as a critical piece, a critical starting point to analyze the context. Good. All right, so now I'm going to go straight into design and just go through a couple things that have come up as important choices when you're working in a conflict-affected location, maybe region, country, zone, where there is conflict and you're doing an education program, how do you make decisions about what elements are more critical than other elements? Obviously, the context will drive, and that analysis will drive most of your decisions. What I'm going to talk about are just some good practice guidelines that people have used over the years and have become important for education programming. Improving access. What is access? Access is going to school. Learning spaces, be that a school, an informal school, a literacy club, they need to be safe. The location of that learning is an important decision. It has to be a safe location. It shouldn't be next to a bar. It shouldn't be next to the border. It shouldn't be in certain places where there are known groups coming through, etc. Just thinking that through. Corporal punishment is quite a common, I want to say, something that is considered in the classroom itself, reducing that violence, trying to work on a program that tries to minimize or at least reduce the effects of that type of violence and offer alternatives, or teaching alternatives. Sexual abuse. Very well known to increase in conflict-affected environments and needs to be on the radar immediately. Access for girls is very often linked to the fear or the known existence of sexual abuse happening in classrooms by teachers, by peers, on the way to school, on the way home from school, in the toilets, etc. So access to education for girls, a huge amount of work has been, body of work has been studying this issue, and so this is a clear lesson that we have, recognizing that's possible and putting in place the mechanisms to minimize this. And that kind of follows on the same just below. So I won't go into that. Innovative approaches. We were just talking about, given the Ebola crisis, schooling might be better off home-based. In Afghanistan, for access to some girls, home-based schooling actually was conducted as an option. Thinking through innovative approaches for access. How to reach the unreachable. Thinking of ways mobile libraries have been used, etc. So thinking of innovative approaches. This is about access. I want to go on to, we need to consider language. Why might that be important? Can anyone tell me why that might be important? Language of instruction.
I believe because it is part of someone's identity.
Exactly. And maybe the conflict is between certain ethnic identities. So language of instruction is a critical consideration when you're setting up, running an education program. And then there's a few more technical things on the slide that you can look at with regards to language instruction and learning to read. What I'd like to also say is curriculum and materials. Did anyone work in Afghanistan under the Taliban? No. Or anyone, if we think about curriculum and we think about materials, we think about books and we think about concepts. We think about identities, we think about representations of identities. What might be within a book or within a curriculum that could exacerbate conflict? Can we imagine anything that does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Actually encouraging one of the things this year before the General Assembly actually was the Sea of Japan, how that's disputed. And so I think when you have different histories for different countries, that exacerbates problems.
Very, very political. Different histories, different identities are represented in these textbooks. People shy away from this in education programming at the height of a conflict. However, there's options. Creating groups, collaborative groups, to start discussing the possibility of revisions. Because again, it at times is an opening to revisit histories, to revisit identities. Depending on the time in the crisis, this is more possible than others, but it's definitely something that people keep in mind at the early stages of program design. Adapting teacher professional development. Lessons we have learned, and I mentioned this earlier, is that very often parents, mothers and fathers, girls, they tend to be more attracted to the possibility of learning if there might be a more representation of female teachers in the classroom. This is often a big challenge if the locations are very far away, maybe in rural settings as opposed to urban settings. But this is something that, with regards to teaching and training teachers, it's a consideration that comes up in program design and is front and center when you're making decisions around what to support and how to support that change. In addition to that, very often we can imagine that children and youth have experienced conflict in individual ways. Some might be able to recover quite quickly, depending on their age, their experience, their exposure to violence. Others, same age, same exposure, may not be able to recover quickly. So one thing that is considered within this developing teachers and getting them to understand ways in which to identify some of these problems in the classroom. What to do if they're confronted with an extreme case where a child's unable to learn, to speak, to interact, to engage, and then how to either reference and connect that student to additional health assistance or to manage that within the classroom environment, depending. So thinking about teachers and their development and their ability to, they themselves deal with what they've experienced, but also in the classroom identify particular behaviors that they know need to be dealt with a little bit differently and how to do that. So adapting your work with teachers in education programs to address the issues in the classroom that might be present. This is a critical one, and Brendan mentioned it, and it's in part kind of at the nexus of much success at the civil society level. Inclusion of community and family in the education process. If we imagine basic services in any community, you will always find some form of schooling. A health clinic might be a bit far away, a little more sparse, water points, but there will always be schools, and depending on where they are. But community and family engaging in the actual content, supporting the learning process, and having a value for education. All of these things lead to the success of education, particularly in conflict-affected environments. Yeah, did someone have a question there? So I think, also what tends to happen in education programming is there might not be teachers available, readily available, or maybe a few. So engaging and thinking through how trusted community members, family members might be working to step up and help out in the teaching learning process. That's a very big one. There's quite a few interesting research bits that I wanted to get into on that, but how are we time-wise? Okay. So, like I mentioned before, there's some instances where you will deliberately create specific programs addressing a particular issue, maybe group, that is linked to that conflict specifically. Very often this tends to be to create or design programs for youth who have missed out on some periods, maybe months, maybe years of education, and may not easily integrate into that grade 1 classroom being overaged. With that, being older and coming into a younger classroom, comes stigma, comes discrimination, comes a lack of a sense of pride, etc. So thinking that through and designing either outside of the school environment, maybe attached to the school at a different time, and thinking about the content, whether it's literacy, numeracy toward workforce development or whatever that is the point is that the program design would likely create a specific program for youth, potentially, given their particular status, their cohort, they're being a bit older and trying to reintegrate into society. And, in doing this, there's often an important step, which means those from the community, teachers and community members, need to really check their own assumptions about what they think of the youth cohort and what their feelings are, and try to work through the positive aspects of what they can do within this conflict environment. Because very often, I mean, there's a slew of literature on the youth bulge and what the role of youth are in conflicts, and again, another session on that one. But this is just a program design element that is a special group. We need to think about that, perhaps create special programs for them.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The screen sharing is just stopped, so we need to put it back.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. There we go.
Actually, we'll go back one. That's fine. So this is my last slide because I think, and an important one, the efforts to assess, monitor, and evaluate programs in conflict zones is a critical and important aspect that is increasingly happening, but still not sufficiently happening within education programs and other programs in these situations. There's a notion that assessment can also be something that's continuous. It's not something that is at the early stage only, and then that's it. That's it for 5 years. In a conflict environment, very often you don't even learn what's happening to specific groups of children or youth until you're 3 months into the program. And so this offers an assessment modality, very often they call that rolling assessments, that makes you and helps you revisit some of the elements of what's happening in the context and assessing it and reassessing it at periodic intervals throughout the project life. This is an important program design choice for work in any conflict zone, but particularly for education, social related programs, because this gives you a sense of learning. And then what happens is if you learn something that you are contributing to the conflict as opposed to alleviating issues related to the conflict, then you can redesign, add activities, take away activities. This gives you flexibility in your program design that allows for readjustments as needed, when needed. Simple, cost-effective tools. There's a variety out there these days that are being created that allows this to happen. And it also makes it easier for civil society groups, the children and youth themselves to engage in these tools, to understand them quickly, and to use them within the programs. There will always be trade-offs about whether this is done by the internal program or by an external person. Combinations are always good because there's different results from each, but it's necessary to have both because you can have extreme bias if you're internally part of the program and you're assessing, evaluating, or monitoring what you're doing yourself. You tend to be a little biased. So you bring in the external people, you get a conversation going with the two, and this is a really important program design for monitoring and also evaluation. Transparency of information. Once this monitoring, this assessment, and this evaluation work is done, this information needs to be brought back to the children, the youth, the teachers, the parents. Transparency is critical because this doesn't happen because of lack of transparency when it does. Meaning, it's a danger. It's an evaluation tends to scare people. They tend to fear what they're doing is wrong. So transparency of information coming back and providing results, discussing results. I've seen this happen in a couple cases, and it's a very effective means by which to quell the fears and to really bring a sense of ownership to the project. So a critical piece to follow on to these assessment, monitoring, and evaluation exercises, bringing that information back to the people that you're working with. Flexible monitoring and evaluation, again, I talked about that a little bit, given the dynamic context that conflicts present. So there I just went through some program design choices, from a variety of perspectives. It's really 7 things. I'm happy to share the presentation as well, so I didn't want to go ahead and read. But just to give you a sense of, what are we doing today as practitioners in civil society with education programs to help effectively children and youth continue to learn. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much to both of our wonderful speakers for those very informative presentations. They've given us a lot of food for thought and things to think about. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a group discussion. Does anyone have questions or anything that they'd like to dive deeper into? Any questions for speakers? Sure. You got the microphone.
To Wendy regarding, sometimes you're saying that there are occasions when you need to focus on the needs of one individual student or a significant amount of the students. How do you handle that in a position where you have 25, 30 students and you're trying to keep them all together and you can't necessarily slow down for one student?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a way to, is this a little?
That's the microphone for the camera, yeah.
I think a way to approach and think that through is from a training perspective. So there will always be someone in the classroom working with a variety of students, often maybe more than expected, meaning classes tend to be overcrowded in situations of conflict, so it's not 30, it might be 90. So, and you might have shifts, etc. So from a training perspective, what you would do then is to adapt a teacher training program, or if it's not an actual teacher, a community member training program, to give them some understanding and some skills on how to think through when they see particular behaviors and they recognize that an individual student may need more help and what to do with that. So giving the capacity to the teacher or the person in the classroom to be able to manage that at their level by asking for help, referring to a health service, or being able to just manage that situation when it is the case that clearly an individual child is presenting particular behaviors or problems that need to be addressed. Otherwise, it's maybe disruptive or it's concerning because of the quietness, etc. So it's really from a capacity building perspective for that teacher or that individual in the classroom to be able to manage that with external assistance.
Thanks. I also had a question for you, Wendy. I was curious, you're talking about program design, and you were speaking of just being in northern Nigeria. And I was curious, how closely are you working with the governments when you go in to set up program design? And do you find conflicts of interest, like working with the central government of Nigeria, going to northern Nigeria to develop programs? I don't know if that's what exactly you were doing.
Yeah. Not exactly, but it's a really good question, and it's interesting because I think when we think about the analysis at the early stage, that conflict-sensitive 6 questions that you need to ask, the government needs to be there. Part of that analysis, part of that discussion. I've worked for a number of NGOs, UN, different agencies, and in these situations, Northern Nigeria, other Congo, South Sudan, Kosovo, and I mean, always involving government is critical. Even as a humanitarian responder, where sometimes government is not so present, you always initiate discussions with the government. And regardless of the tensions, I think there's something to be said for giving them a place at the table and having hard talks about what's possible and what's not, and in particularly that analysis stage. They're from that country, the government knows what's happened in the past. They will have a benchmark for what as a practitioner, as a program you're aiming at. They'll know when you've surpassed what your goals are as a program, because they've been there for many years and they understand. Now, there's disagreements and I've seen different case scenarios where they've stepped back and said, really, we need to, go ahead and do part of the programming, or they stepped up and they said, I'll lead the coordination group to have these discussions ongoing for many weeks. So there's different scenarios that tend to play out, but I would say regardless of conflict of interest, there's a common ground, and that's worth working on.
I have a question for Brendan, actually. I was wondering if, to go back to your
the definition of attack on education. I mean, you explained all the different facets of it, but I was wondering if strikes or big public protests are actually part of the data set. So, for example, the events you've seen during the Arab Spring, or recently what you've seen in Hong Kong, would that be counted in your global data set?
Well, there's an overlap in the sense that some of the incidents took place during the protests. So, for instance, where in Yemen, a lot of the protests were held alongside the campus of one of the main university, I think it was, in if I remember correctly, in the capital, and in a number of countries where there have been protests, particularly the case in Sudan, there have been attacks on universities by security forces during a protest. So they'll go into a campus dormitory, and there'll be some assaults on students, or maybe some killed in some countries. So there's the strikes provide a context. But then in terms of schools, you get the situation where, such as in Nepal, where there are lots of what they call bans, but political strikes that are called by one party or another, which disrupt the school program, which have an impact on education. But we haven't included those. We haven't included something just because it's a strike in our data set. You could argue, you can argue where the boundary should lie. We've kept it out because we felt it was a little more diluted from what we were really trying to focus on. But it's a good question. It's part of the where do you put the boundary of the definition.
You were talking about the emotional and physical protection. Like in case of Gaza schools, they lost the emotional and physical protection. How would you design a project for that to just compensate what happened?
Right. I think there's quite a few people on that, working on that as we speak, absolutely, and have been for many, many years in Gaza. In fact, one of the models that has been used over the years to respond in that very early emergency situation has been to limit, in a sense, the rigor of academic goals and pull up the social and emotional goals of the project. What I mean by that is and maybe some of you have heard of the term child-friendly space, safe space, child-centered space. There's many terms around this very quick response mechanism and program that often has educational activities inside it. It's designed in a flexible way to meet the needs of the population in crisis. And so that may mean in multiple shifts, that may mean at certain times. It allows for the entrance of teachers or trusted adults to be supervising groups of children during the day, so that during that period, parents and community members are able to organize around, organize their own lives while their children are supervised and taking part. And again, the goal being that each of the children or youth that are taking part in these child-friendly spaces have the time to express and engage in activities that they choose they want to when they're ready to, meaning there's available activities, there's organized times, there's actual things to do, expressive things to do, and it's the child's choice whether to engage and how to engage and to what extent when they're ready to. So it's working on the assumption that there's been disruption in the social life and in the emotional status of the child, that it's allowing the child to come to that recovery process on their own. So this model is something that you can Google. There's guidelines that have been developed around how to set up child-friendly spaces. At the interagency level, there's been kind of agreement on what are the main rules and ways to organize these spaces. So this is kind of something that happens in that particular case.
You mentioned youth bulge. So I've been working on a project in Yemen, and that is one of the primary drivers of instability that they identify, the USAID identifies. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I guess I could say just a couple things on that, and maybe Brendan has something to say on that as well. I'm not sure. But that would be probably a whole other meeting. But what I could say is, you know, there's been an incredible amount of excellent research that's kind of worked out how it is that these large populations of youth in some developing countries may be a contributing factor to instability, particularly if there's high rates of unemployment or et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, from a programmatic perspective at the civil society, local level, there's quite a gap between these macro level analyses and these micro level issues. And so this hasn't yet been, in my view, worked out sufficiently to really inform one another effectively. So that would be just a general comment, but again, there's lots of debates and ongoing research that's helping to tease out, you know, what that means for a country and to what extent it's having an impact on learning and stability for a country. Thanks for the question.
I would just add that youth bulge is a potential driver of conflict where their education and training and job opportunities are not adequate. And there have been many analyses of the Arab Spring protests in various countries in which the lack of employment opportunities for graduates is a factor in the unrest. It's just a factor to think about. I'm not qualified to talk about the programming, but in terms of the contribution to conflict, that's certainly something that's been raised.
I wondered whether any of the participants have had experience related to education in conflict that they would want to reflect on.
I've not worked in conflict environments, but I work with Head Start here, and you see a lot of kids who are from developing countries who have similar social emotional aspects that you would find based on abuse or things that happened maybe before they moved to the United States. And so I think the social emotional aspect really lends itself to early childhood, especially preschool age, early grades, and building resilience in kids at that age, especially in conflict environments, I would think would be really key to a program.
I had some experience, limited, in Sierra Leone, where our real focus was on the reintegration of former child soldiers. And I came to the conclusion that a critically important element in successful reintegration was for young people who had maybe even initially been forced to become soldiers, but their identity, because their survival depended on being a successful soldier, had been transformed, and successful reintegration depended on their developing a new identity, and being a student was a very powerful thing. I remember interviewing a young man who, not that long before, had been in the bush. He was probably 14 or 15, pretty husky guy, and somebody I would not have wanted to have encountered during the conflict. And here he was in a school uniform, pink shirt, short sleeves, short pants. He was a school prefect and very proud of that. And just talking with him, he was seeing himself as a student. He wasn't focused on having been a soldier. So I just came away powerfully impressed with the importance of that educational opportunity and integration as part of identity transformation, which I think is at the core of successful reintegration of former child soldiers.
I just have a short question. Like, as the other speaker said, that the education and unemployment is, I think the education mainly, and then the unemployment is the reason for the Arab Spring. So, how we, do you have like, I don't know, research or programs designed to, because there's like the cause of unemployment in this region is the weak and the weakness of the educational system. So people graduate without good. They are not qualified enough to have a good opportunity in job markets or something like that. So is there like some kind of research to link the gap or bridge the gap between the education system, the quality of the education system, and unemployment in the Middle East, for example?
Sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not quite clear about the question there. You're saying?
The quality of the education system in the Arab Spring countries is also led to high rate of unemployment. Is there like kind of program you can do or like work on like improving because the curriculum need to be improved actually. It's getting like worse than ever. I mean, so what effort do you do to help in that?
Well, I can't talk about programs, but what I could say is that there is sometimes a problem with university systems in some countries, that they try to copy the curriculum in Western countries rather than developing a locally appropriate curriculum. So sometimes what they're doing in a university system, with my other hat, I'm actually one of the founders of University World News, so that's just why I can talk on this. But what they do sometimes is that they don't provide a locally appropriate curriculum, and then they churn out graduates who don't have the right skills for the jobs that are actually available locally. So if your education system isn't sensitive to the employment needs in your country as opposed to internationally, that can lead to a problem, a political problem.
And maybe to add, in a conflict setting, one of the program design choices is to review curriculum for particular, misrepresentation or discriminatory practices. But, again, a program that clearly is aiming to align skill set with employment opportunities, that review process can also happen with those curriculums at the higher education level to readjust, particularly given some of what's happened in as a result of the Arab Spring and changes that are going on in the country itself. Sort of a review of the curriculum to see, how do we then build back better and make sure this alignment of skill building is then linked to the workforce needs in that particular country.
Hi, Maureen with Wellspring Advisors. I just was interested to hear more about, in terms of utilizing the tools, do you see it being done by governments, by faith-based groups, by NGOs, and a little bit what's the effort to engage the broad spectrum of groups providing education?
Well, I would say, and I don't know if you would agree, Brendan, that education in emergencies, education in conflict, education in general, this realm of work is quite expert at sharing tools, applying tools, discussing tools, developing more tools. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think there's definitely hosting places these tools are hosted in, fora for discussion of studies and tools, and also fora that bridges practitioners, donors, academics, a very robust practice area with lots of networks of actors that do tend to talk these through. I think the application, clearly is driven by the mandate of the individual agency and, buy-in from the individual agency on whether or not that applies to their own perspectives and what they aim to achieve, etc. So there'll always be a little bit of a negotiation there. But I find that the new tools that have been developed and the tools that are out there are clearly shared and vetted and discussed and available. Use, it would be a good study, but I think the majority come on board with it because they are evolving. It's not a static area of practice.
Wendy, would you want to mention where some of the guidance and tools can be accessed?
Sure. Yeah, and I think one of the key networked agencies, and I mentioned this briefly before, and Brendan, you might have things to mention about the Global Coalition for Protecting Education from Attack, but the INE.org tools, so the Interagency Network for Education and Emergency, I think they may have changed it to International Network of Education and Emergency. This is a network of, I think, upwards of now 7,000 members. It's an open network where you can sign up and get newsletters and bulletins and keep abreast of what's happening both in events and tool development and evaluations, programs, etc. So this is a good hub for information about education, working in conflict, also in disaster. There's a whole range of research studies posted, etc. That it's actually quite large, so it will take time to navigate. That's one area. I think, Brendan, do you have anything else to add?
Well, on the question of how useful they are is an interesting question. How well does anybody actually? There's a whole industry of producing tools, it seems, but there's how well they're actually their feasibility or their use is measured. I'm not sure. I mean, we came up against this in the project we worked together on when we developed some tools for protecting education in conflict-affecting countries, and we went to a couple of countries to test them. And when we were discussing that, we were told that was unusual, which I found strange. But then we also came against perhaps a reason why, which is that it's not that easy to actually to rigorously test the usefulness. I think some of it's and actually that was evaluated by Search for the Common Ground, but it wasn't easy. Yeah, so I don't know how well they're used or how useful they all are, but certainly INE is the most well-respected source for education and emergency tools. But they have a slightly different emphasis than the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack and that series that we produced for the education cluster, which is much more about education that's attacked as opposed to just education in conflict in general. But even when it comes to I'd be wary of any tools to do with protecting education in attack, in the sense that there's very little scientific sort of research into which measures work and in what context, and you have to be very careful about pushing things in one context that might have been used in one context in another, and that's why I think it's so important to ensure that there's some local sense of ownership of what's being done, so that you don't impose something from outside that may be inappropriate.
Brendan, where are the 3 reports available on attacks on education?
Well, if you just Google education under attack, there's one was in 2007, one was in 2010. Those 2 are by UNESCO. But those 2 will be on the UNESCO website. If you Google them, they should come up. And then if you Google education under attack 2014, that will come up on the Coalition's website, which is I think it's protectingeducation.org. But if you Google the name of the study, it will come up straight away.
Yes.
Well, you were asking about working in conflict or post-conflict education. I worked up in northern Uganda for a bit. I was curious. It's definitely not a violent attack on education, which wouldn't fall within Brandon's definition, I don't think. But one thing I noticed was school fees being a major problem implemented by the government and making it so many of the youth in the post-conflict area could not go to school. And I don't know if you could say that's an attack on education or a problem with resources within a struggling government, but especially in the North you see that. And I'm wondering if that's kind of on the radar. It's a possible non-violent attack, but seen as an attack on education, limiting access.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an interesting question because you're then in the area of fair distribution of resources in the north and in the north up towards Arua and around there in the area that was associated with supporters of a previous regime. They don't get as much resources for their electricity and other things, and sometimes it's to do with the political affiliation of a tribal group or a local ethnic group, whether they get a fair share of resources or not. But I'm wondering what area you were talking about, because Uganda brought in education.
Gulu mostly.
Gulu, yeah. But what year? What year were you talking about?
Be like 2005 to 2000.
That's interesting, because by then all fees were supposed to have been abolished. They were abolished in I think it was in the late 90s in Uganda, and it suddenly brought a massive influx of primary students into schools. I went to schools there where there were 150 children in one class.
Yeah, they're supposed to be abolished, but it's quite tricky, because you have to pay for specific uniforms, you have to pay for the books, you have to pay for all sorts of things. So at least all the youth, or not all, a lot of the students that I'd work with, especially ones who couldn't go to school, they speak of school fees, and there's the idea of universal education, you could say, but really it comes down to you have to have money to go to school.
Yeah, and I would agree that hidden fees is what they say now, where you have these UBE programs where there's no fees anywhere in the country because of conflict, so you take that fee away, but however, in reality, the day-to-day, the books, the clothes, the materials, they're all fees in a sense, but they're called hidden costs, and that's a huge issue in these contexts. Yeah.
Just to provide an analogy to what you're saying, I believe that to some extent transportation can also be considered to be a hidden fee, because when kids are supposed to go to the school and they don't know how to have access to school, it can also be considered to be problematic to some extent.
I think there's also, it's not only hidden fee, but like in my country, in Egypt, for example, you have the public education, you have the education you pay for, but you go to the public education, students learn nothing. They don't until the 6th grade, they learn nothing. They don't know how even to write their names. So if you don't have the money, you won't have your children in a good education, as a good schools, that you have to pay a lot of money. So this is another thing. It's maybe not hidden fee, but it's like presumed to be going to school but learning nothing. So this is something else you can have to, yeah.
Well, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
This is a question, I think, for both of you. My name is David Makoff. I'm just wondering, Brendan, or the causes for the attacks, for the targeting of targeting of schools. Are there? I'd like to ask just simply about the motivations for most of the worst targeting. And also the question for both of you, Wendy, are there efforts or strategies in defusing some of these causes, if it's whether in doing something to make the less hardcore the groups on the margin to be less interested in targeting these schools?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and some interesting developments occurred in Afghanistan on that front. I mean, there are lots of motives for why schools are attacked, and in some cases, the attackers are able to able to get away with it in a sense because they don't feel that they're alienating the local community, and sometimes that's because the local community doesn't feel that the schools are their schools, that they feel that the schools have just been built by the government without consulting them. If you're in southern Afghanistan, for instance, you're in the Pashtun area, you may feel that the government in Kabul is not really your government because Afghanistan doesn't have a long history of feeling together as one nation. You may feel it's something being imposed by outsiders, so you may then be suspicious that they're imposing alien values, which then gets translated into Western values because the government's seen as being associated with the West because they're accepting Western military help or for whatever reason. And then it's assumed that the schools it's a short step then to assume that the schools are anti-Islamic. And then there was a period, I think it was in 2009, it might have been 2010, when the government decided to try and explore this perception in negotiating with both armed groups and local communities to get schools that had been closed reopened. Some of them closed because of threats or in areas where there were a lot of threats. And they negotiated. When they negotiated, what the feeling that came out was that people thought schools were anti-Islamic and teaching un-Islamic things or had an un-Islamic ethos. So they made certain concessions, such as bringing in time for prayer, bringing in allowing a locally a trained teacher, but a local teacher, to check on the school to see if anything un-Islamic was being taught on the curriculum, or to review the curriculum materials, and the government pledged to change anything if they were, because they were confident that they weren't. So there is an example where it's not just about what the militant thinks when they attack a school. Something that may help, it may raise the price for the militant to attack if they think the local community is against them attacking the school. If they're against that community, they may not feel that way, but if they see it as essentially a community whose support they want, if, for instance, if they want to take over the government, they don't want to alienate the massive population, they may take more notice if they notice that this community is resisting and doesn't want their schools attacked, or feels that the schooling system is theirs and not something imposed from the outside. So sometimes the measures taken by the education authorities are important, and sometimes you might find that schools that are run by NGOs and have been collaborating. This happens in Afghanistan, where even international NGOs ask the permission of the local Taliban whether it's all right to set up classes or set up a school before they set one up, in order to get some sort of buy-in. And the Taliban actually, in a lot of areas, actually has a shadow education director wandering around checking that schools are running, whereas they've attacked a lot of schools. In some places, they're actually issuing threats that if the schools aren't open, they'll do something. So it's not really a laughing matter, but it is ironic. And but it just gives you an idea that some of it is about winning the support of the local community for a local education system, and that's a factor that has to be taken into account in some situations.
And unfortunately, I have to go now, but just to add and reiterate a little bit, I think that that local community buy-in, that input into content, that ability to see, what are the alliances, and that importance of really rolling and assessing continuously the context, so as to understand, the dynamics of the conflict and how it's either promoting or inhibiting learning. I think there's a whole range of work going on around countering violent extremism, and I think there's also some potentially more military kind of security-focused initiatives that I think we should shy away from conflating that with education at times, because I think that can create sometimes more dangers than good, just to, as a last. But thank you very much. Apologies, I have to leave. Great to see you, Brendan.
And you, Wendy.
I want to thank Wendy and Brendan. But before we conclude, we do reserve the last few minutes for just any kind of information exchange amongst participants, either online or in the room, related to upcoming events, related to children armed conflict, new reports that are coming out, somebody needs a consultant, and so forth. So is there any information that anybody would like to share before we break up?
Sort of a
reverse. I need this information. I was possibly somebody could be in contact with Wendy to have her send that PowerPoint. That some of the graphics with the 6 questions was very interesting.
It will be available on the.
Absolutely, yeah, I'll send that out. Did you sign up on the sign-in
Yes.
sheet? Okay, perfect. Everyone who's got their email on the sign-in sheet, I'll share the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, the Search for Common Ground website has a section for Washington Network on Children on Conflict and the various written reports on old presentations and now the video of more recent ones are or will be soon available there. So it's an excellent resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And referring to that point, we filmed today's presentation, so if anyone wants to rewatch or share with your friends, it'll be on the WNCAC website by the end of the day today. Thank you.
Any other information anyone wants to share? Well, just thank you for coming. Appreciate your contributions, your questions, and see. Anything you want to add?
Good. Thank you so much for coming. Grab a bagel on the way out.